Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Adam. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Not bad. Semester is in full swing now. It's kind of fun to be back on campus in a way. Campus is full. You hear music playing, you hear people doing stuff. Oh, it's a good feeling. I really hope we are not going back to lockdown ever again.
Are you teaching courses?
Yes, I do. This one is undergrad course, but I do find that even looking at undergrad material, you always discover something new. There's always something that where you feel novelty. We may have talked about that. One thing that I always found fascinating is how to teach recursion, and I'm never stable on that. I keep changing how I'm teaching it because I always feel there must be a better explanation. There must be a better one. I mean, if you're a mathematician, that's easy, right? Then it's easy for you to think in this term. If you're not, what is kind of the way to explain recursion to somebody who doesn't understand the mathematical concept or doesn't have a good way of talking about induction? And I find that incredibly interesting because recursion is essentially what made us go from made us discover language in a way. Probably language is recursive, and it's a move from symbols, from just clusters of symbols or conglomerates of symbols, into something that you can chain together, and then it has meaning and can refer back, and you can create links across levels and all these things. I think this is one of the big mysteries, how that works. It's one of the big mysteries why our brain can't handle that. And I mean, the DNA probably has some element of that too, right? It's clearly not just the local quantity. It's lots of non-local properties of the DNA. So I find recursion extraordinarily fascinating as not just in its most simple form of computational recursion in a program, but actually as a more general principle of similarity and things that refer back to themselves, to parts of themselves, possibly crossing levels. And language does that.
Now, how do you begin in the course? Like in terms of getting these ideas across to the students?
Well, I don't try to do the whole depth to students. That's not what I'm doing. But the point is the fact that students ask and students want to understand forces me to think about that deeply again. And I've done various ways of doing that. I mean, one way that I'm actually quite fond of is I had that developed in discussion with Stas Tyomkin, is essentially these Russian dolls. I know Russia is a bit out of fashion these days, but the dolls are still a nice example of recursion.
Troishka dolls, I forgot something.
Matryoshka, yes,
Yeah.
matryoshkas. And you have this doll, and you open it, and inside is another doll, and there's another doll inside, and it goes all the way. And what I was really beautiful about that is kind of there's a similarity, but there's also a difference, right? So recursion is a kind of form of symmetry, if you like. It's like a type of broken symmetry. Basically, the little doll looks like the big doll with the one little difference, something that has changed. So it's a renormalization group, if you like, to look at it this way. And what's interesting is that seems to be actually one of the examples that students understand very well. For some reason it's very natural. They say, oh, there's inside and inside and inside. It's very similar to each other, all these matryoshkas, and it has to start somewhere. It doesn't go all the way down. You can't make them arbitrarily small. At some point you stop, and that is something they understand, right? The problem with the recursion is usually what makes recursion so hard to understand is not so much the base case, which is simple, and even I feel also that undergraduates often find the base case, okay, that's simple, that's obvious, right? Why do we have actually to deal with it, right? So here you have to explain to them why it's actually complicated and not trivial, that the base case is the place where you put your ladder on the ground. But the tricky part is, of course, the recursion step. So where you say, if I know how to do the smaller one, I know how to do the bigger one, right? This translation, that is kind of the thing that it's very difficult to explain. And no matter how much you explain, either it looks trivial, like the example with the ladder, where it's not clear that the ladder example has a problem that students see it too much in an iterative fashion. So if you're climbing a ladder, what I used to say, okay, the ladder has to be placed on the floor, and then you have to know that you're on the rung of the ladder, you know how to go to the next rung. That's kind of the recursion step, or the induction step, if you like. The problem with that one, with the ladder, you can too easily create an iterative picture. So you climb, and then basically there's now no complexity. They don't see the trick of recursion. They don't see why it's actually interesting. With the matryoshkas, you have the advantage that it's clear that there's some kind of self-referentiality. There's the same object, but smaller. There's some kind of, and usually you open them, right? You don't start from the inner doll. You start from the big one. And that's exactly what recursion does, right? So you start from the big case, go lower, and then when you're at the bottom, then you go back up. That's the thing that kind of you need to get. And the ladder example, although it's correct technically in terms of an induction principle, it's too simple to serve as a good motivation for recursion.
So you need to have some kind of complexification through the recursion process, and then you backtrack it to this kernel or seed crystal, and
Yes.
and explain it, and then you retrace it back up through the generative process.
Exactly.
And hopefully at that base case, or rather, it must pan out somewhere, or it must bottom out, and then hopefully you can explain that too, where that came from. That's kind of I've been thinking about like problematic and non-problematic forms of recursion and with respect to actually embodiment and homunculi. So like this idea of like we don't want homunculi in the brain because of the problem, like because you need a control, you need a little person to control the little person to control the little person. But what I've been wondering is whether at least for vertebrates, or I don't know if it's vertebrates, but whether, or for us, there might actually be something very homuncular about the seed, and maybe not just the informational object, but homuncular in that like the homunculus might even be like the physical body and the morphological computation itself as like part of this kernel that then gets kind of virtualized in the brain. But I don't know, this idea of like what are problematic homunculi or not, like what's a good because there does seem to be something very homuncular about our minds in terms of like our intuitions and the constant task of controlling the body. And so like I'm like people say beware of homunculi because of the problematic recursion. But I'm wondering like, wait, what if though like some of the major data structures of our mind are actually fairly homuncular in their character?
That's an interesting question. I do think that, as always, the truth is somewhere a messy state in the middle, in the sense that sometimes recursion is really what happens, right? I mean, you delegate things down, you split the tasks up, we might have a kind of, to some extent, some kind of oversight mechanism in the brain. At the one stage it stops, right? So at one stage it's just not going to go anywhere beyond that. So it may stop after 2 or 3 levels. Say, I'm just inventing here a number that doesn't have to be true. I'm just saying that you might end where you say, okay, you can't reduce further, right? And that is something that is quite interesting to see, because I think I brought it up earlier, right? One interesting way to see things that work parallel in the brain is actually music, especially classical music, where you have, for example, multiple voices, right? I mean, multi-rhythms exist in many cultures, and people do them. And it's very hard to know how well do people actually control these multi-rhythm. Can they really control them explicitly? Even in classical music, you have multi-rhythms, and yes, you can control them to some extent, but it requires a lot of practice. With voices is a bit clearer, because the voices are a little bit more varied, right? The multi-rhythm is more or less fixed, right? So it's 4 versus 3, 5 versus 3, 7 versus 9, whatever it is. Complicated multi-rhythms are things, but they are kind of stable, and then they change as a chunk. With voices that go in different voices in classical music, it can change all the time, right? This voice, and it does this and does this. There's a certain character that keeps fixed, but how many can you follow? And it looks like, if you look at Bach, for example, who is considered the pinnacle of, say, fugal multi-voiced work that we are still listening to, I think you get to something like 6 voices. Okay. Now, there were actually composers before Bach, which did something like 48 voices. 48. Clearly, this didn't survive. It didn't work. It clearly was an experiment. People don't listen to that anymore. So for me, there's an indication that there must be some limit of how much overlap of different separate lines of independent or half independent attention tracking can coexist, right? And the other thing is, of course, how many layers of self-referentiality can you have looking back? And if you look at good literature has this ability of making you think back half a sentence, a full sentence, a page, a chapter, perhaps an earlier book. That's what good literature does. But I think there's not much more than that, right? You probably won't be able to get 30 layers, but that's not at the same time.
It seems like the depth almost might be part of what we mean when we say something's meaningful. It's like, how many layers can you take up? Like, what's
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Ambiguity is absolutely. You also get ambiguity, right? There are 2 different things. There are, how many layers can you take at the same time? And how much ambiguity do you do? Ambiguity is not the same as layers, because ambiguity means you can jump from one to another, while having the same layers is the depth. Ambiguity is breadth, if it makes sense.
So there's like the range of options at any given point that this could apply to. You don't know the scope of relevance at any given point, and that's like what in any given instance, how many things could be related. But the self-similar, like the multi-scale autocorrelation of so depth versus breadth, ambiguity.
And I must mention a really interesting article that I read. It was one of my feeds. I'm afraid I would have to reconstruct where it came from, but it's easy to find. It actually was talking about morals, and it was talking about moral code versus moral language, which I found that, and the gist of the article, if I understood it correctly, I will give my interpretation of the article, is that some people treat morals as a code, in the sense like people who would treat a language like a one-to-one mapping between symbols and meaning. So this symbol means that, the symbol means that, the symbol means that. No ambiguity. It really always means that and nothing else. And the author argued that it would be making much more sense to treat morals as a language, in the sense that meaning does not always keep fixed. Symbols may shift meaning depending on context, and that context is something where essentially decides what meaning it has, right? So, for example, if you say a double agreement, is it a positive thing or is it a negative thing?
Double agreement.
Yes. So double negation, that it's not always clear, right? And not yeah. This ain't not going anywhere, right? That is double negation, but it's not meant as a double negation. It's simply a strengthened single negation. So double confirmation.
Double confirm. I mean,
is it positive or negative?
I have to say that intuitively what's coming to mind is almost like a protesting too much, but I might be misunderstanding. Like an actual negative thing came up. Or it seems like at first it's like positive, like an enthusiastic affirmation of something. I was like, wait, maybe the enthusiasm is like, is it warranted? I don't know. Like kind of.
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
So here, this was the answer to that, right? So you brought up a completely different aspect that also is negative. So over enthusiasm, the lady doth protest too much. I like that. I didn't think of that. I was thinking about the sarcastic version of that. Yeah, right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So but this is fun because we actually have two different ways of making a double affirmation sound negative. One is just sarcasm, and the other one is not sarcasm, but it's clearly not believable. There's some element of there where clearly somebody has an agenda that's not actually matching what
it's like you're violating like a kind of Gricean maxim of like pragmatic, efficient communication. And so then the other meaning is like, wait, well, why are you giving me these extra bits? It turns out there's an additional meaning that's
exactly
very context sensitive, and the cipher will completely depend on the context.
Exactly. And so I really like this idea that morals should actually be treated like a language, in that what is right is not hard-coded necessarily, but depends on the context and sometimes a lot on it. And every time that people try to find a moral decision in a difficult case, in an ambiguous case, philosophers have this.
The laws of robotics.
Sorry?
The laws of robotics.
The laws of robotics. So they all find there's an element of trolling in the way these arguments are made, but once you treat it as a language, it becomes a little bit clearer. And that's why I really like this article. It becomes it's clearer that where this ambiguity comes from. It's because morals and meaning are very similar in terms of context. They depend on the context. They cannot be seen in isolation in general. It's very, very rare that a word means exactly just one very simple thing. Usually when you talk to children, and their morals is also quite black and white, right? Once you get older, it's clear that words are not always the same thing, right? When you talk to a child and point to a dog, then you mean just a dog and that's it, right? But when you talk about a person, say, oh, that person is a dog, well, that means something else, and it's ambiguous, and it's very clear that you don't mean that person has a furry body and a tail and stuff like that.
It's part of why in attempts to like identify people's like latent emotions from their facial expressions aren't working particularly well. Like it's the context sensitivity, but like the expression, can mean very different things. Like, is it triumph? Is it a grimace? Is it like smile? What does it mean?
And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you don't. And in fact, poker players are known for the fact that they can't even express when they're happy. So they win the competition. And I remember distinctly where they showed this world champion in poker, and he won this prize. I don't know, it was $1 million or whatever it was. And he did not even make a little move with a face. And of course not, because that's what he's training all the time, to hide any vestige of emotion, right?
That'll train you if you do that all day long.
Sorry?
I mean, I imagine, I just was thinking like, wow, if you do that as seriously as your practice, that might have bleed over effects, I imagine, to the rest of your life. It's a
Clearly does. And the problem is really, it's a bit like the story. I don't know whether it's true, but I heard the story about the surgeon who actually loved to eat meat, but it was always his wife who had to cut his steaks for him, so he would not lose touch. Would never cut flesh with a feeling, without the feeling of being careful. And that was very interesting. I don't know whether it's true, and probably many can switch context, but maybe he was such a good surgeon that he really needed to be completely in the zone when he did cutting movements, and he really would not, under no circumstance, take a risk of losing that type of focus. We don't know.
Seems like a good practice for him, but yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, sometimes context switches, right? I mean, I like talking about music because I understand a bit about that. So if you switch, for example, from piano to organ, the embodiment is completely different, right? People don't realize that, right? They look at the keys and they think, okay, these are essentially the same instruments. Yes, you know where to put the fingers, you can elicit the same harmonies, but they are very, very different instruments, and they behave differently.
Interference and like cannibalism of like shared networks, and like
you need to be careful. Yes, you need to be careful.
But like that example with the surgeon, like you could see very easily like there being that sort of destructive interference of the representations. But like if you're switching between instruments, maybe it's actually synergy. Like
in that case, it can be. There is also the fact that some people don't like to learn both Italian and Spanish, because the languages are so similar that they bleed over, but they are afraid that they mess each language up, one of the languages up. So say somebody who's reasonably good in Italian will be careful not to learn Spanish as amateur, because it's just going to mess up his Italian. And there's another effect, and that is actually quite a sad story. Some musicians, especially pianists, are prone to that. Sometimes even famous pianists disappear from public life and stop playing because they can't move the fingers properly anymore. They can't move them independently. And the story that goes, again, I put disclaimers all over the place here, but the story that goes is that because the pianists are trained to really be super precise, they have huge areas for the fingers in the brain. These areas are really, really large, and they map out with high detail where the fingers go. The problem is when the areas become too large, they start overlapping, and then you get interference. And then they can't actually make the fingers move, and then they have to retrain them, which is quite bad if you imagine that. I mean, you spend all your life getting these fingers really doing exactly what you want them to do, and then you have to actually start retraining them because you essentially, in the language of information, exceeded the capacity of the storage that you use to resolve your action sequences.
that would be an existential level event to like have that kind of dedication, and then the very dedication led to you losing the thing you were so dedicated to. I don't know if this I want to come back to it at some point. You were saying we can handle to a decent degree multi-melodies, but we can't handle as well multi-rhythms. And it seems like we're doing something, like we can do it, but it's a particular kind of training that creates a certain realization that's not, you said, explicit. Like, I would like, could there be like something also in terms of like, when those representations become large enough, like, so well, the two things are coming to mind. One was like, are we dealing with like, is it some function of like the rhythmic syntax of how you get coherent communication in a brain? Or is it the limitations of basically some sort of serially operating bottleneck that might lead to, so I guess, that seems like a deep rabbit hole that like I'm not gonna let go of that thread.
There is some seems to be some evidence. There are some very interesting pieces of work by Nori Jacobi. I think he did some work on actually visiting various cultures and various tribes in the world, and to see, is there some kind of preferred rhythmic structure that people use, like 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And it seems to be that there's a strong preference for 2s and 3s. So that we like 2s and 3s. 4 is okay, is again easy, but 4s are simply 2 2s, right? So 4s can be, you can see how that's organized. 5 is already requires, it's doable, but the tendency is to split it into 3. Da 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 da, or da 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 da. That is kind of something that tends to happen. Even if you look at classic pieces, that have a crazy rhythm. So, for example, a piece that is really hiding it very well is Take 5. Take 5 doesn't feel odd at all. If you take the Brubeck piece, it doesn't sound odd at all. Usually 5er rhythms sound odd. You feel there's something off. Not in Take 5, you don't notice that. It's very well hidden. There's another very famous piece that is a 5er, and most people will know that one. It's actually the maybe you know it, the Mission Impossible theme. And the point is, the 5er rhythm makes it a little bit uneven and creates a sense of urgency. It basically feels like something is off, something wants to move on. There are really interesting rhythms with 7. For example, Prokofiev's, I think it's the 3rd sonata. I think it's the 3rd sonata. I would have to check. And their last movement has a 7 rhythm, and it's still broken up. It's, you know, it's 3 4 or 3 2 2 or 2 3 2. It switches around in this way, and so it's not really proper 7 rhythm. That's not what happens. It always has this pa 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 pa, whatever. It builds up this weird. There's another one. I think that's also Brubeck. That's Unsquare Dance. If you don't know it, I recommend it. Go on YouTube and watch it. It's great. It's great stuff. The interesting part about these things is we don't like that. And I do think it has exactly to do with what you talked about. It's kind of temporal bottleneck. You cannot process too much at once without chunking it somehow. We like to group things together. Maybe that's also the origin of grammar. And there's a pressure to arrange these things. It's not unique. It's highly non-unique, and that's why I don't believe, actually, we talked about that already in Chomsky's idea of the universal grammar. I don't think the universal grammar is a priori. I think what happens is the opposite effect. You have a constraint on information, and that strongly constrains what solutions are reasonably close to the optimum, reasonably optimal. They don't have to be perfect, but they have to be close to the optimum. You try to optimize them. And they're not arbitrarily many. They're combinatorial amount. So there's a finite amount. I don't know finite, but it's a discrete set. And that was what creates the illusion that there's a kind of a priori grammar. Right? But I don't think the grammar is a priori. What's a priori is the sense of compression.
there's only so many coding schemes that are workable, like that.
Yes.
But because I think I got this from Dennett. Throwing spears pointy end first is a universal, but there's no need for that to be innate. It's just a good design solution. But this is in some ways more fundamental. It's like it has like the real, like almost like a Platonic mathematical reality. It's like there are some stable informational structures and ways of carbon chunking things.
Yes.
Huh. It seems like we may not want to go down this route, but like I've heard Chomsky with his somewhat seems to have maybe softened a little bit on the richness of the grammar in recent years with like his minimalistic program. And he'll talk about maybe you could do it all just with like a merge operation. But like would that be enough for the kinds of rich recursion, or is like but I guess in a way it's like looking for that kernel, like what's that initial so what would be the origins of recursion in language? Like how would you
What a good question. What a good question. I mean, in the DNA, we can kind of speculate, and I will speculate wildly, right? I'm not an organic chemist. I'm not a stereochemist or something. I don't know anything about the hardcore details of that. But let's speculate wildly. Let's sit with a beer or coffee or what tea in the tea shop and just talk nonsense into the air. If you look at the DNA has very local structure. So they are triplets and they're following, and then they are in a spiral. They basically have this helix structure. But the helix structure is not the only structure you have. Now you have the beta structure, and then you have the next layer, and so on. And they are again coiled together in various ways. So the way how the chemical potential, not the chemical potential, but the kind of forces bend this thing, they operate on different time scales, or rather different spatial scales. And these spatial scales, now, if this was an abstract space, it wouldn't really matter much. But it's not an abstract space, it's a 3D space. And there you get a constraint, a spatial constraint, that if you bend this thing for enough, then suddenly two things that are far apart on the flattened ribbon of DNA become close again. So there would not be close by if this would happen in an infinite dimensional space. But it's not an infinite dimensional space, it's a 3-dimensional space, and therefore they have to bend, and at some point they might meet each other. There might be places where they meet in this way or that way. So in other words, the way to think about it is that's how I interpret it, is you have all these mid-range, long-range forces. Because of the constraint of the space you live in, they start getting this added incentive to come close in some cases. And of course, once you have evolution can make use of this to create additional meaning on higher levels. The interesting part of that is, how far can you abstract that? We know that when we write programs, we write code, we don't like these long-range interferences. We really don't like them. So we do everything to avoid it. What we do is we say, okay, structured programming. So code goes, the program program flow enters the function here, leaves a function here, and you have well-defined entering and exiting conditions. And the reason for that is that we don't evolve, right? We have to think about what is this doing, and we abstract away, and we factorize different operations, so don't interfere with each other outside of what we permit them to do. Right? We want an addition. When you have an adder, you don't want the adder to start influencing the multiplier or some other unit of the system. You really don't like that. Nature doesn't care. If that works, fine.
I'm connecting this back to earlier, you're talking about how periods of stress to a system can potentially increase its adaptive capacity because its initial development, these entanglements can form that like limit its continual evolution, and that you actually need to break up these attractor networks. And maybe it's partially basically you accumulate this technical debt, this spaghetti code with long-range dependencies, which are basically placing historical accident constraints on you rather than functional constraints. But that's interesting. And so so the DNA, it's like you have this primary sequence, and then you're going to get these levels of emergent geometric form from the stereochemistry will take certain forms, which will be a determined product of the sequence. But then the stereochemistry is now relating these elements on this other scale in a way that'll influence their functioning, but that is a function of the very thing that gives rise to the stereochemistry. And so now you have this kind of it is hard to cognize recursion. It is hard to it's taxing on working memory.
And the problem really, that real recursion, the recursion that happens in a DNA or in language, they are not clean. These recursions are dirty, right? In math, what we like to do, we like to separate concepts. We like to put them, this is this, this is this, this is this. We separate them nicely. Of course, people who like to do category theory, I'm currently in the process of learning how it works and what it's doing. I'm far from being any type of expert, but it's very clear you want certain concepts to be sharp. You want certain things, it holds or it doesn't hold. That's it. There's no intermediate level. But nature isn't fussed about that. Nature can handle ambiguity to some extent. Actually, it is actually an advantage of being ambiguous, because there's an interesting thing about languages. When you talk to somebody, having some ambiguity gives you room for negotiation. You can, for example, talk to somebody, you want to invite them to your party, and but you don't want them to feel bad. And so instead of saying, I'm inviting you to my party, then the other side needs to say, no, I can't come, or yes, I can come. So they're not left with the option of negotiating a way out. But if you say, oh, there's this party I want to organize, I don't know, maybe you want to come, and so on. And people do that because forcing facts on other people is usually considered rude. There are some cultures which are more accepting of this. So if you go to German or Dutch culture, they like that better. And some people actually joke that that's why Germans are good at math. Because okay, this is true or it's false, but it's not true, actually. When you interact, even there are things where you do negotiate. You leave this option, and you leave this leeway of linking two truths together. You keep that open. And I think life does that too, all the time. You have to negotiate. You don't know how your world looks like.
On the one hand, I was at first I was my initial response, which I think is naive, was a kind of we're giving people, I don't know, plausible deniability for their mixed motives in politicking. But then it's but now I'm wondering actually about what you're saying about the necessary context sensitivity of morality. And I'm wondering actually if it is rude, actually giving someone a little bit of open, you're actually making room potentially for what they need to do to handle complex and ambiguous situations. And you're actually harming them because you're disempowering them, but not just with respect to Machiavellian double dealings, just with respect to life is complicated. And we don't, and so it is rude, isn't it? Okay, that's an update for me.
And if you look at the exception where, for example, this ambiguity is removed, is the military, of course. because you really don't want them to misunderstand you. Say you go to the left and you attack from the left, you don't want them to go to the right. Right? We're not talking about things like Auftragstaktik, where you basically give them a mission, but leave it open how they do it. But you want to be very precise. You give this order, attack this, conquer this hill. That's what you want them to do, not something else. That has to be very, very clear. However, even there, good armies, well-run armies, have a concept of negotiation. So well-run armies usually have a phase where the underlings can actually challenge the order in a formal way. They can say to their commanding officer, we believe that this problem, right? They have a way of challenging what the commanding officer intends to do. The commanding officer still makes a decision, has to make the decision so that you don't get basically a split of commands. You don't want that the two people do different things, right? But the point is that a well-run army allows for usually this feedback to make sure that all the data have been covered. Where the command is split, actually, a bad thing has happened. We know that from history. There are many, many examples. Like for example, the two-consul strategy in Rome was a very problematic strategy, as it turned out, when, for example, the wars against Hannibal. Basically, they lost an army of 80,000 people or something, because they basically had conflicting ways of handling an army. So negotiation is sometimes not what you want, but I would say most of the time it is what you want. And then politics, especially, because politics is not clear. You have the problem that in politics, people play multiplayer games, right? What is a multiplayer game? Multiplayer game consists, okay, you have a game, there's a goal, and many players are there. And so it's very unclear who will you make a pact with, who will you betray, and so backstab, whatever in these games. But in real politics, it's much harder, because even the value function is completely unknown. Sometimes even to the players themselves. Even the players themselves don't know what their value function is. And we're not talking about incompetent players, which is an additional complication, right? You can have incompetent players that mess up everything for everybody else. But we're talking about competent players who still don't know what the value function is. And therefore, negotiation is about finding out what the value function is, for example, part of it. When you do business, and you're trying to sell something to somebody, you want to know, does that person actually want what I have to sell, for example? And maybe yes, maybe not. Maybe that person doesn't even know what they want to buy. This is a famous saying of Steve Jobs, right? Producing things not that we know that people want to buy, but produce things that we know people need, and just don't know it yet. Which I think is a very interesting thinking, because what it does is kind of projecting forward a universe where this need already exists.
You create demand if you can create the high enough value offering of the supply for the solution to the problems that people didn't even know they had, or they didn't realize the solution would be possible. It's like if all of a sudden someone showed up in a town and he made really excellent longbows. All of a sudden you might have a bunch of longbowmen, that might be a longbowmen and women become, that's a practice there. And it wouldn't have been if someone had not come up with that clear vision of what would be possible if you can get that high quality design. And that's
exactly
interesting about the with the military command. It's like, I'm thinking that, like you were talking about like reach through earlier, and it seems like for this complex adaptive system of this sort, where you want both adaptability, but you want the coherent functioning without dithering or very costly bifurcations or conflicts. You want the reach through almost like to be bidirectional. Like it's not just like you want like to there to potentially be meaningful influence. And now of course the religion of self-organized criticality comes in. And I'm thinking of like systems that respond to both large and small events. Like that can.
You want an efficient sensory motor loop, right?
No.
You want, I mean, let's face it, it's hard to do that artificially. but it's not that expensive to do that in biological organisms. Organisms are full of sensors. They're full of sensors. If in doubt, put more sensors in. Right? The problem is not the sensors. The problem is processing the information. Right? But putting sensors in is, nature. Yeah, you want a sensor, just give you sensors. Ask the octopus. Right? I mean, the skin, basically the whole skin can take on form and color of its underground. How do they do that? They need to have really detailed sensoric mechanisms and highly distributed to boot. Yeah, so that is clear. The reach through must be both ways. And if we believe that empowerment is in any form has any form predictive value, then that's what it says, right? Your sensors must be able to pick up what your actuators do, and vice versa.
You have to know it.
You have to know it, yes. If you don't know it, it doesn't count.
Also, just the formula, like the flux that the flux of information that your sensor is conditioned on your actuation.
Yes.
Yeah, just to get the data structure.
Yeah, because otherwise, if you do something and you don't pick it up, so what's the point of doing it?
So in terms of different degrees of sensitivity to small elements being able to, so centralized command and control versus the ability to adapt based on a slightly more anarchic response. So I sometimes wonder how this plays. So I've been wondering how this plays out differently if you're talking about a controller for a body versus like a body politic in terms of like the kinds of decisions. And like, so for instance, like, so for like, could we, for instance, in terms of preventing dithering, the necessity of like clear winner take all dynamics just for the sake of coherent action, do you potentially want like this ability to like have a centralized controller that can dominate dynamics? However, you also want to be able to have like maybe like a rich repertoire of softly assembled reflex arcs. So like I'm kind of like going through the kitchen, trying something different, and I'm trying not to drop the thing, and I'm like creating ad hoc affordances as I go, and it's just sort of like a very loose direction, and then they softly assemble to whatever makes it work. But at the same time, like if I want to like do like a very intentional, I might need like a conductor with a firmer hand. I don't know. So I'm just thinking of like, there's trade-offs here. And I'm wondering which trade-offs are appropriate in which circumstances, and what are solutions that allow for a little bit of best of both worlds, but still going to be trade-offs. But yeah.
This is a fascinating question. So I completely agree with you that it makes sense sometimes to do the strong grip, makes sense sometimes to delegate. Sometimes you can do both, right? So let's first of all look at what type of actions exist. The actions that you can do in parallel, right? So if I'm, shoveling sand into a pit, I don't need a single person. I can have many people in parallel, and they won't mostly interfere with each other. I mean, they will maybe
parallel.
Sorry?
It's embarrassingly parallel. The more people in general, like
Exactly.
I guess there is like the surface area of like how many people are. There's a topology, but still, it's very parallel.
As long as we stay well below this constraint, below this Planck surface of the sandpit, we are good, right? So we will not see much of a problem. There are things that don't work like that, right? And this is, by the way, one of the problems that people that talk about industrial impact of research don't understand. Sometimes you have to go through all the steps to get to the point where you can actually make something usable, right? Having, more projects that do something, it doesn't make better projects. It just makes more projects. Of course, you may be luckier that you get a breakthrough, but the number is not always essential. One great idea can offset 100 bad ones. I mean, the classic, this is classic.
Venture capital formula, they look for the unicorn.
They look for the unicorn if they do it right, yes.
Yeah.
So this old joke, maybe I even told you told it earlier, but it's well known, where this industrial magnate talks about money saving opportunities, talks to his advertisement expert and says to an advertisement expert, look, is the advertisement really helping us? Can't we cut down some of that? He said, well, the advertisement guy says, well, we know that only 10% of our advertisement actually are effective. So 90% are not effective. The industrial magnate said, well, cut them out. And then the advertisement expert says, well, we don't know which one, which 10%.
That's the crux.
That is, I think, the key here, right? In science, we don't know that either, but there are some things that happen in conjunction and some things that happen in parallel. It's not in conjunction. Some things that have to happen in sequence, some things that happen in parallel. And I now pretend it's accurate, right? In reality, it's even messier, right? It's really not clear what happens in which order. And sometimes things have to happen not just in parallel, they have to essentially constantly feed into each other, right? So process of development is messy business. But in first approximation, you can say there are two types, is parallel and serial. And when you have parallel, yeah, you just put more people on that and it will be faster. If it's serial, forget about that. It's not going to work.
So is the process of attending to multiple voices in a fugue more parallel than the process of keeping track of sort of rhythmic unfolding in time? Is this more
It's an
serial?
interesting question. There is an element of parallelity to the rhythmic unfolding time because you have to have memory. You have to remember at least the sequence that you've been running, and you have at least to remember the last beat. Probably not more than that, but at least that. So I would predict, if you were to make an experiment, my conjecture would be that these people have a memory, especially for really complicated multirhythms, that lasts back at least one cycle of this multirhythm, but not necessarily more, because you can forget everything that comes before. That's kind of what I would expect in a multirhythm. And you know, there is an advantage in writing music down, right? So many cultures don't need to write music down. You can improvise fantastically. That's not a question. Nevertheless, being able to write down stuff allows you to make really big forms, things like symphonies, sonatas. They have really long range structure. They have lots of long range structure. And if you look at the late symphonies of the people like Brahms or Beethoven or you know, the Mahler, then you really can see that they are all scales. At all scales, there is structure. It's on the long scale, on the short scale, on the middle scale, everywhere there's structure. And that's very difficult to maintain when you have to have it, you know, improvise it in your mind. I wouldn't exclude that there's some geniuses that might be able to do something like that, inventing almost a sonata. But usually when you look at improvisations, even in classical music, even very, very well versed classical music improvisations, they don't usually do that. The improvisations are, I would make a prediction that if you do experiments, there will be much more short scale structures and very little long scale overarching structure. So you would actually lose something, and we have that. When you write it down, you can actually play around with it and fix it and adapt it. And I heard about a theory that, again, this Nori Jacobi told me about that, but I don't have the source for that. One would have to look it up. That the sonata actually was not invented, but discovered in a way. So the sonata form was actually had to look this way under certain constraints. There were not many other options, which I find very interesting as an idea.
It has a kind of Neoplatonic reality.
Yes.
We had to, it's a form, a coherent form in an abstract space that happens to manifest in this plane of being.
Yeah, so in other words, if you go to some alien planet and they have similar constraints for some reason, they might end up, at least for a certain time of their development, with a similar form, which was really would be very weird. But still, I do think there might be some variability there. But again, it might be like language, right?
Similar form given like the constraints of the universe we're in, or like similar form given constraints of like, are we talking all possible worlds? There must be sonatas. Like,
Well, assuming there's time, right? And assuming there's information. I do think the real constraint for information is that you need something like time. Not sure what happens to information when time becomes a vague concept. So there are people who say time is emerging from the quantum level. And if that's the case, it's a good question. What does information mean in that circumstance, if it means anything at all? Right? Because in Shannon information, time is critical, right? You can do away with space, you can do away with meaning, with distance, with anything, but time remains. So I would say that to formulate information, the question is, can you get rid of time? Can you make time emerging and still talk about information? I don't know.
so what kinds of time do we need to talk about information? Like this, so like people like Ravelli talk about like emergent time. Other people are, flipping it and talking about emergent space. I guess Carol is more of that school, but that would not, so a universe without Shannon information, that would not be much of a universe.
I'd like to think that way. And maybe it is always there. So the question that I'm asking is, do we have to change something about information in the moment that we say time is not anymore the absolute, ordered system? And I think a good thought experiment would just start with special relativity, right? Look, special relativity, their time is already a little bit more fluid. You can move, you can change your coordinate system, you can change your observer, and suddenly the timeline looks slightly different. The question of what happens to information there. It's a very interesting question, in my opinion. I'm not sure to which extent this is understood, but I would say this is worth looking at. So you basically say, I have my Shannon information going forward, and now I switch perspective. The question is, what does happen to the information? Is it compressed? Is it just shifted to a different location? Is it what are the things that remain invariant? Are the things that are changing? And we do know that it's not entirely invariant. We know that. That is easily seen if you do a simple thought experiment. Think of the classical Doppler effect. In the Doppler effect, you have a frequency. The frequency is clear. If the frequency is high, you can transfer more information on it than if the frequency is low. So if you run away from a source of noise, of sound, for example, then this source of sound becomes less informative. You stretch, you reduce the information. And so basically you can say that as you move away from something, you suck out information, you slow the information down. Vice versa, you move towards something, you increase the information you get. And of course,
That's convenient. I mean, it's just for us, that's a convenient thing, like in terms of like, that's exactly the situation you want. Like as you're moving towards something, it might be good to have a better sampling rate from it.
Yeah, that's just a lucky event. It could
Yeah.
be the other way around, right? There's no, nature is not that nice.
Thank you, universe.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to look at is the black hole is, of course, the ultimate redshift, right? The black hole, something that essentially moves away from us, if you like. And so anything that comes from a black hole comes at a very low rate, very little information. Now, this is interesting because it tells us something about, okay, what happens with the information? Is it conserved? Is it not conserved? I mean, there's this big discussion. Does a black hole destroy information? I personally don't think so. That's just my personal, opinion, that the unitarity of quantum mechanics might be broken on a large scale. Universe scale might be not that obvious in the singularity, but on the border of a black hole, I don't think it should be broken. So in other words, I predict it's too much, but I would think that if the black hole contains this information, just not necessarily in the form that you can easily recover. Right? It's a bit like when Eastern Germany fell and they destroyed all they shredded all this paper, right? They thought the information was lost, and then they were unfortunate, because then basically the West German entities took shredded paper. These were small pieces of paper, but they were not infinitely small, and they actually reconstructed them using computers. At that time, they could already do that. So shredding paper is not enough. If there's enough, enough readiness to try to reconstruct what was there. There's enough redundancy to permit you reconstructing what was there. Now, I'm not saying that black holes are like East Germany in terms of shredding the shredding information, but maybe information can be reconstructed to some extent. In any case, what it shows, it's not obvious. Once we move away from the simple linear time, it's not exactly obvious what is conserved about information. Yeah, how you probably have to rescale it. You have to rescale information against the local geometry of the field, of the gravitational field, or of the coordinates. The coordinates will matter in terms of what happens to your information, even on the classical level. Not even talking quantum level. Even on the classical level, you will already see it. So we don't need to talk about quantum states if we want to talk about what happens to information when it comes from near the black hole. As a spaceship sends information, tells us a story, and takes forever because the information rate is low. So clearly, information is not invariant to coordinates.
In this case, it's the spatial coordinates of a preserved locality, but not so for the shredded the paper shredding, actually, how do you know when you're dealing with a randomization, like a shuffling, as opposed to something that has just been very efficiently compressed by a coding scheme you don't know? How can you disambiguate between like something appearing to be
well, this is hard, right? I mean, we know that, essentially pseudo random number generators, it's hard to decode them. There's a reason for that, and maybe the difference is not real. It's just the case. In one case you know what you're doing, in the other case you don't. But I don't know enough about cryptography to give a definite answer on that, right? The existence of one-way encoders is indicating that, at least in the classical, the directionality is not invariant. You can encode things in one way and find it hard to decode it the other way. That's at least if in classical, according to classical knowledge. P and P, whether they're the same or not, plays a role here. Maybe the whole thing will break once we have quantum computers. Maybe they will just break the whole classical cryptography completely. And if that happens, then they come with a remedy right away. Namely, quantum computers can perfectly encode everything and make it safe again. That being said, I personally don't think that the computers are the weak spot. if you want to find out secret stuff, the human factor is the far better attack vector. Far better, far easier. Yeah, you just get somebody to click on the wrong link and you're done. So, you know, you can talk about quantum cryptography, but it's not, you really, if you want to keep information safe, the easiest way to do it, don't keep it on a computer. There was, I think, even at the time of computers, there used to be the saying that the German Secret Service had a room where they had a computer there for typing, but the computer had no internet connection and had only a disk. This was at a time where disks were already out of fashion. The point is, basically, you had to physically transport the data out of the room if you wanted it to be transported. Of course, today with you know, small cameras and smartphones and so on, it gets harder and harder. So basically, I personally think it's almost impossible to keep data from leaking at some point. But again, that's a different story, and not really the main issue here.
People will talk, or just they can. The best exploit of a system will be the humans.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it doesn't have to be, but the chances are, let's put this, that's the easiest attack vector. It's much easier than breaking. I mean, once, and it doesn't have to be that the person talks. It's enough that the person is careless in what they do. Right? You just have to carry, I mean, like this minister, the British minister, carried a bunch of papers out of the office, and he was 30-40 meters away from the press, but they took such a good photograph of that they could increase the text, and it was clearly confidential. Good to see a confidential text, like in the movies, just better quality.
This might be an analogy too far, but I'm thinking like the trade-offs of systems with different amounts of bidirectional reach through, or more distributed versus more centralization or more distributed realization. And also thinking of like the conservation of misery principle. So it's like, if you the best way to keep a secret is for no one to know it, but then you can't plan with it.
Including yourself.
Yeah.
Including yourself. So, and that is, by the way, also in some games where you need to be very unpredictable to play them well, it's good if you don't know yourself what you're going to do in the next step. So ideally, there are games where it's actually the best thing that you don't know what you're doing, then you throw a coin, because that's keeping you from leaking information. I mean, the simplest example of that is, of course, rock, scissors, paper, right? We talked about that at some point, I think. When you play rock, scissors, paper, if you can learn from the opponent, then you become better, right? Then you can respond to the opponent. If you let the opponent learn from you, they will become better in counteracting you. But the point is, at the end of the day, the best strategy for both is don't leak anything. Be completely unpredictable, and that's the best strategy.
Wasn't there a Sun Tzu quote that at one point, like, if you'll win every, could be a misfire, but I thought there was a Sun Tzu quote you told me at one point that might relate to that.
Sun Tzu, yeah, well, that would fit Sun Tzu, right? You don't want to be predictable. It's very important in these games you don't leak information, essentially. It depends, of course, on the value function, right? Sometimes you want to leak a bit of information, sometimes you want to leak it all. So, for example, in games, let's call battles between animals that, for example, compete for a female, especially dangerous animals, often don't fight deadly. They make a ritualized fight that demonstrates who's stronger, and the other one can get away. So, for example, snakes, they're quite dangerous animals. when they fight, they don't usually fight to the death. They have a special formalized fight that basically helps them determine, okay, this snake is the stronger one. The other one just gets away. And we have that a lot with dangerous animals, right? Less dangerous animals, they don't do that usually, because usually they don't have a natural thing that stops them from destroying the other member of the species. This is something that I think was observed. For example, if you cage pigeons or cage animals that normally are not caged, then they can actually kill each other under certain circumstances.
I was thinking like with stags, yeah, it doesn't seem like they're trying to gore each other. Exactly. And even some of like them coming up with a fishing tournament for a sustainably playable game for their species. I was wondering, like, part of it could just be like mutual behavioral shaping over the course of development. But with the snake, not so much. Like that would have to be worked out, like something at like the level of like brainstem pattern generators, like just the logic of like you want escalation and you have like these reactive dispositions of the animals. But I mean, I guess there could be a good amount of behavioral shaping too, even for the snake. They're reinforcement learners. But interesting.
It's a Nash equilibrium in a way, or a half cooperative Nash equilibrium, in the sense that if they're completely antagonistic, right, then the snakes will wound each other badly, right? Injuries are there. One snake may die, the other one may win the competition, but they're still inferior, weakened, and therefore actually not that good a mate anymore, right? So the fact that they competed actually put them out of the desirable selection pool. And that is, of course, not what you want, right? You want the selection pool to be a representative of the ranking of the snakes without actually being too costly. And so, yeah.
Is this another way in which excessive directness can be rude, and in which maybe another way, even with something like the inherent ambiguity potentially and context sensitivity of morals, like another way is so it could be, so I was thinking, at first the cynical view is it's rude in terms of, you're blocking people's, we all just kind of like accept there's weird Machiavellian double dealings in social dynamics if you just like give people a freebie and plausible deniability. But that's like, wait, no. Another reason is life is complicated and you actually need those degrees of freedom. But then there's another, you might even be making the person vulnerable potentially. If they're like, if you reveal too much of your hand, like of what's driving you, could you be is there like an incentive to actually like for me, like, I tend to wear my values on my sleeve and just like, look for allies, but like, do you also make yourself vulnerable by doing that? Because then you've set up basically your exploits are advertised. Like your most powerful levers on you.
This is a classic one, right? I mean, the current political situation is a very good example for that. Sometimes you do not want your best weapons to be seen, right? You are in a conflict and you have, say, 3 levels of escalation you can pick. And maybe the conflict is not worth to you showing the best weapons you have. Maybe one side of the conflict that's not mentioned, that will just make it hypothetical, has actually weapons which could decide the conflict, but it's not worth winning this conflict to lose the secrecy about these. I mean, classic examples, of course, Enigma, right? I mean, there's this legendary. I mean, it was well known that the British held back a lot of life-saving information that Enigma would have provided just to keep the edge of the weapon sharp for where it mattered in terms of strategic importance. That's morality has gone out of the window there, right? The whole morality questions has gone out of the window, and it ends there, because it's the end of morality. Once you are at this point, you must give up on discussing morality, because you can say this or that and shift here and there, but in the end of the day, if you sacrifice you know, a lot of people just to keep your weapons, you know, or your edge alive, you know, you've made a morally very, very ambiguous decision. And that's where things, and this uncertainty is, as you say, is very prominent, especially in antagonistic scenarios. In cooperative scenarios, it's much less so. So if everybody is cooperating very well, you can be quite direct. So if you have a very, very well working team of people and you're under time pressure, you can say, Steve, hand me the hammer. Steve, bring me this. Jack, do that. Hannah, we need to move on this.
Trust. And you can
exactly. Nobody will be offended. Everybody knows why we're doing that. Everybody knows nobody's going to play power games here. It's about getting things done, right? So the word trust is very important. Yes, I agree. This negotiation is always necessary when you do not know exactly what the agenda of the other side is. And it may be cooperative, but you don't know it. Or you don't know how the other person will react, because simply they might misinterpret you. And now we are back to this question, where does the recursion start? And there's not, you can't assume that it starts anywhere in the end of the day. So if you look at Roxas's paper, the recursion ends in perfect noise. It ends in perfect unpredictability. That's where the recursion ends, right? It could start at a very well-defined initial point when you scale up as you go through your history, or it could start somewhere in the midst of the past, which you can't fathom, you can't unravel, or it could simply, you know, start just in noise, because that's the point of least information. And then you build information when you feel, yeah, I can actually give some information out, where it gives them an advantage to give information out. That's why the US and the Soviet Union had a red telephone that they could use to warn each other if there was something going wrong. Information was an asset here, suddenly, despite the antagonism of the two sides.
In terms of conservations of misery, I'm thinking of just like, well, even if you have like a lot of very strong cooperators, that's a system perfectly set up for invasion by unless it has self-protecting mechanisms in play, some sort of defecting agent or pattern. Like, all right, so
yeah, I mean, the key here is to come back to recursion, simply to close the loop of our story, is concept of recursion is very deep. It's much deeper than the more you think about it, the more complicated it becomes, more interesting it becomes.
Well, I think we've gone a few levels in, and I'll be iterating on that for quite some time. Thank you.
I thank you for the opportunity of discussing this with you. I do think that I think we covered some crazy ground, and you know, I think I understood a few things a little bit better, a little bit, just I don't know. I mean, I felt perhaps it's just an illusion.
Well, a shared illusion. Looking forward to the next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.